Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's feeling great today. My name is CK Asinas, and I am the host of this special Alter Cup 30 Philippines mini-series, where we discuss and cover the stories of the humans behind the program. It's really, really wonderful to have you all listening to this content, and we really look forward to perhaps sharing a lot more stories for you and for you to discover as we explore, the different accounts of people and the essentially the minds that really run Alter Cop, from the back. And for today's discussion, we'll be talking about collective action. Collective action meaning, you know, institutions, entities, people, groups, and communities working together for a shared goal. And you know, there's actually one big question that really runs through my head, and it's that what happens when communities stop waiting for permission and start becoming catalysts for change? So that's why we have three leaders who discovered the same truth. Climate action doesn't begin with top down mandates, it begins when people understand their power and are enabled to it or to use it. One of them facilitated mapping sessions where all staff shared stories that do not reflect from large data sets ever. Another watched students realize they could redesign waste using systems redesign waste systems using nothing but creativity and campus culture. And a third reopened the doors of a national institution after a pandemic, transforming it into a space where everyday people could redefine what resilience means. Each understood that enabling communities isn't about giving them answers, it's about creating spaces where their knowledge, experiences, and innovations can emerge. One of them now leads participatory climate planning at a university level. Another teaches that everyone can co design solutions. And the third champions an approach where no one is left behind. Together, they're building a regenerative future where communities aren't just stakeholders, they're the catalysts. And so I'd like to welcome to the show these three incredible individuals: Daniel Siratilia from the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, Patrick Chongson from 30 House Philippines, and JL Algo from Action Klima Pilipinas. Gentlemen, friends, thank you very much for joining the show. How are you all today?
Good.
Thanks,
Thank-
CK. Thanks for having us. We're doing great.
Likewise.
I see a thumbs up from JL. Yeah, I mean it's 6 p.m. now, and it's really nice that we can still feel your energy. And I think this is something that in the next an hour and a half is something that our listeners would really relish, because this is not something that we can pull up together. Because from my experience, it's been relatively difficult to catch you all alone or as solo, because you're always in between or around crowds, and that really speaks about your magnetism and your capability to harness and nurture the communities that you are working with. And that's really a big thing, and something that not a lot of people can actually achieve. And so that also speaks about your capabilities as community leaders, who also serve as enablers for catalysts, as we mentioned in my intro spiel. Now, gentlemen, how about we start this conversation by know, backtracking to, going down memory lane and recalling some of like the early challenges that you have had with your respective initiatives and your organizations. Let's start with you, Daniel. Let's open this conversation with this question. You chose a hybrid participatory approach for the Ateneo Climate Action Plan instead of relying solely on existing government data. Walk us through the moment you decided that this bottom up approach is necessary, and what were you hearing from the community that existing data wasn't capturing.
Thanks, CK. So, really diving into the meat of the discussion. For listeners' contexts, I work at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and we're the hub for sustainable development at the Ateneo de Manila University. And part of this work is crafting master plans and action plans like the Climate Action Plan and Biodiversity Action Plan. So I head the Climate and Disaster Resilience Program. So we are the ones that are working on the Climate Action Plan in particular. And really, from its inception, we really wanted to make sure that we could incorporate, participatory mechanisms for a more bottom-up approach to crafting this plan. And one avenue in particular that I'm happy to expound on later is the creation of a risk map for the university. Now, for context, the largest campus of the university spans 89 hectares with three additional graduate school campuses that are all spread across different cities in Metro Manila. And so government data does exist and it can give us, risk scores or risk maps on the level of the barangay or the village, but it doesn't really adequately express that risk on smaller scales, such as the campus. And if you have, say, an 89-hectare property with varied topography and vegetation, then your risk to climate hazards like extreme heat, flooding, and strong winds will not be uniform. And so there's a quote by Dr. Greg Marland and his colleagues in a paper that I like to cite every time I talk about this point, just to illustrate why it's important to do this exercise. And it goes, humans and ecosystems reside in local climates, not in the global average climate. So imagine if you have like, data sets that tells you what climate projections are or what climate risk is for the entire Southeast Asian region. Okay, so you've got your mainland Southeast Asia and your insular Southeast Asia, and you have a single score or a single variable for that. When you try to dig deeper, because of how varied and how diverse the topography and the ecosystems are in these regions, it's sort of unreasonable to expect that you'll have the exact same score for, let's say, um, Thailand and Vietnam, who are both on in mainland Southeast Asia, and let's say the Philippines and Indonesia, which are in insular Southeast Asia and are at a much more diverse geographical spread. And so going back to the scale of the campus, the challenge then was how do we come up with, this sort of downscaled version of climate risk that is stakeholder informed? And in a way, it was really just us going out on a limb and seeing what nuance we could capture that the barangay or city level data just wasn't telling us. So we got together and tried to figure out, how do we make this a participatory activity? Which group of stakeholders do we approach? And how can we meaningfully integrate their inputs into the plan? So this is how the concept of the climate risk map was born, and we decided to leverage on existing structures in the university system. So we weren't also, poking around in the dark, approaching random people for no reason. And this existing structure in the system is called the Local Unit Emergency Response Team, or LUERT for short. It's much more handy for me to refer to it as LUERT. And this system is enshrined in our campus emergency management plan, and it basically divides the university administratively into different clusters of LUERTs. And under these LUERTs are what we call the building emergency assistance teams, or BEATs. So you've got your LUERTs and then you've got your BEATs on the individual building level. And all of these teams are comprised of staff who work there, and they're activated during times of emergency. So they're very familiar with what goes on in their particular local unit or in their specific building. um, there's a photo that I'd like to share on this, where we have a presentation with members of, let's say, the grade school Lubert. And this is just basically to illustrate that um, while we have, let's say, a unit that is only from that only represents, stakeholders from the basic education unit. We also have another photo showing stakeholders from the social development complex. And the social development complex, while it's much smaller than, the grade school grounds, are really made up of representatives from different units and different buildings. So we decided to divide the university geographically rather than just administratively into these different risk zones, which are loosely based on the Lewert and Beat system. And then we invited these groups to several sessions of the community climate and disaster risk assessments, or the CDRAS, just to uncover what nuance we were missing.
Wonderful. And I think, that's an innovator activity right there, because um you mentioned that you went out of your own limbs to be able to do what you're supposed to do. And it's really not easy to localize all of these known frameworks or standards that are being adopted globally, and to make sure, just to really make sure that from our local context, we were able to catch up and help our stakeholders, especially those who are not so familiar with these new concepts, be able to uh, make something out of them, and really uncover a lot of like the answers that that you are looking for, so that you all can work together and um, essentially identify the problems, and also eventually the solutions to those challenges. And so thank you, Daniel. Now, um, Patrick. So just talking about innovation and enablement, your 3.0 house workshops teach that everyone can co-design solutions, and but that's not how most climate initiatives operate. What experiences convince you that everyday people, the students, community members, and other regular folks, could design climate solutions without waiting for experts or massive resources?
Thank you, CK. Before I expound on that question, I just also want to give a bit of context, like Daniel. So I work for the 3.0 House, which is essentially a community project of ACTED in the Philippines. So ACTED is a French nonprofit that has been around since the 1990s and mostly works in developing countries. But in the Philippines, they have been here since 2012. And we operate by providing humanitarian and needs based relief in developing countries. But I think this 3.0 House, which I am managing in the Philippines, is a focused effort to do long term support for the ecosystem in terms of providing space, resources, and other needs that the ecosystem would need or would like to use for the long term. So, going to your question, I think this is also admittedly to give a bit of more context, also something that we're also wanting to experiment or pilot as well. We've been doing this in the 3.0s for a while, but I think it's only now or recently that we've also become more explicit with this belief that everyone can co-design solutions. And the reason why we believe this particular, I would say, principle, no, is it comes from the fact that we all understand what good design is, no? I think we have an understanding of what is bad design. So, for example, if you watch a movie and you say, "Oh, this movie has been really good," or I like this dish a lot," you understand the aesthetics or the appeal of something through some sort of design criteria, no? And it's the same also in appreciating bad design, no? I mean, we can say, oh, this bridge was built really badly, or I didn't get the best customer service on this airplane. And I think we can also say the same for climate solutions, no? With regards to what we're doing in the 3.0 house. So um, I would say that well, for starters, no, perhaps design has been perceived, sorry, I'm coughing, from the
No
point
problem.
of a technical perspective. No, that we think that if you're a designer, you're probably a graphic designer, industrial designer, perhaps some sort of engineering designer, which is true. No, although we'd like to expand on that by saying that you are already a designer in your own, I guess, consciousness by virtue of being able to create something. By being able to uh, offer a product or service to another person who is in need. no, and additionally, you actually create that something with someone else. That's why it's co-design, and I think in that sense, that's why our belief is that everyone can co-design solutions, because admittedly, we all, I guess, are a part of the answer. I mean, not any one person here can give the total answer to what climate change is, and I don't think we ever will. So it would take a whole village, a whole concerted effort in order for us to be able to design something, whether that's from the perspective of a student who thinks, just like, for example, maybe I can teach my peers how to better recycle. That's not deep technical knowledge in the scientific sense, but it's also a piece of the puzzle. A piece of how we can work towards collective change. No, or if it's someone who's like on the technical side, like Daniel, who's helping to provide their university with a climate, I guess, assessment of their geographic area. That is another type of contribution to the climate solution. And so I think overall, uh, my recommendation and my encouragement is for us to think less about design as something that is very technical in nature, and more of something that we are innately, I think I would say, born with, and we just have to activate. And design comes out for us, I think, in different ways and in different perspectives and interests. And I think that's what I'm here to advocate for, especially in this conversation. So yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, everything you're doing is so wonderful because just the term code designing itself is already collaboration coded. Like you can't, it already screams you can't design alone. It takes a community, it takes a group of people with, maybe different experiences, lived experiences to come together and pitch in all of their ideas and create. Oh, okay. How about now? Sorry about the interruption. I might have pressed the mic. Yeah, sorry, folks. It's on me. But yes, just really going back to what I said earlier, the diversity aspect of it, just being able to, um, you never know who you'll be working with, and just the idea that you come in there, you never know who you're gonna be working with, and then maybe you probably are set with something that you want to do, but then you come with, or fresh knowledge comes to you through a person or a group of people, and that just really helps shape your perspective also, and that eventually also helps you shape your solution to something a little bit more grounded and realistic. And I think that's really where we breed really fantastic solutions. And I like that enablement is actually really hard coded in what 30 House is doing, especially also with AIS, with Daniel, and everything that the program, all of the program that he mentioned earlier. And so now I pan this question, the next question to JL. Now, JL, you had this daunting task of rebuilding Action Klima Pilipinas, and what you did was to launch the Katumbalikwasan at the National Museum. And if I look at it correctly, I think you're also with Green Convergence at that time. You can show a photo. It's not a conference or a policy forum, but rather a brand new program. But for you, JL, why was it important to you that this revival happened in a space that is accessible to all Filipinos? And what does that say about you, who you believe should be working on climate action?
Thank you for that question. And to better understand uh, how why I would respond to that question in a certain way, please allow me to briefly introduce Action Klima Pilipinas. It's the Philippines' leading civil society coordination network on climate action for the past 2 decades. The network has had a rich history of uh, people from different sectors, different walks of life, representing the most vulnerable communities that they work with within their respective organizations, basically working together to bring a united voice to policymakers and other stakeholders at the national level. That's basically our focus of work in Action Klima. But given the changing landscape of addressing the climate crisis, we have also begun to venture into different other scales of work, global, regional, and of course the local level as well. And you can't really have a whole of society approach without really going, especially at the subnational or local level. At the moment, Action Klima Pilipinas has 48 member organizations as of last Sunday. And uh, since you mentioned as well, CK, Green Convergence is one of our members. So some of the most famous and most prominent environmental and climate CSOs in the Philippines, you can say Green Convergence, you can say Greenpeace, of course, you can say Haribon, the one with the birds, you can say WWF Philippines. Uh, Basically, my job as the national coordinator of the network is to, well, try to unite every single one of those member organizations into, like I said, a united voice so that when we engage with different policymakers, especially the Philippine government, uh, we have a coherent voice in terms of decision making inputs, or when we lobby for certain legislation to be passed in Congress, or as you can see in the picture here, even a simple presentation of documentation when it comes to the activities that our network has conducted over the years. And what the photo that is being projected right now is from the launch of our exhibition at the National Museum of Natural History, which we will go to in a bit. But at the moment, since you asked that question, CK, the story of Action Klima Pilipinas for the past 5 years has been a story that is pretty much reminiscent of how the Philippines should adapt to the climate crisis itself. And I just basically answered my own question because the way to go in terms of the journey of Action Klima is adapt to the environment. So basically, my organization took over the leadership of Action Klima because we do have a bit of a democratic system even within the network itself. And at the moment, at the time rather, that was October 2020. And of course, that was in the middle of the pandemic. So we didn't have resources because it was the pandemic. Of course, the political environment was even more restrictive for civil society groups than it is today. And that's saying something. And again, that also has a little bit to do with the pandemic at the time. So it was very difficult to really implement that whole of society approach to be really that inclusive. But like I said, we have to adapt. We have to make the best of the environment that we find ourselves in at the time. And basically, for the past 3 years, or sorry, for the next 3 years after that, we began really rebuilding Action Klima, even with those kind of restrictions. And actually, I took over as national coordinator more than 2 years ago, around this month as well. So we need to acknowledge that the the level or the playing field, figuratively speaking, when it comes to climate action, especially in the Philippine context, is not only changing but also expanding. And if you look at all the policies, all the major issues that have been discussed this year, and I'm not even going to talk about flood control because we're going to be here for another 2 hours, most likely. But when it comes to different issues, when it comes to the climate crisis, you want to talk about mitigation. You want to talk about adaptation. You want to talk about loss and damage. You want to talk about just transition. There's even biodiversity, right? There's and disasters reduction. There's so many fields that are being addressed on this year alone, and this year is not even over yet. That for us, of course, in Action Klima, because we particularly focus on climate policy and governance, it's very difficult to keep track of. And we're talking about dealing with executive branches of the government. We're talking about dealing with lawmakers, the UNFCCC, ASEAN, among many others. So going back to your question, CK, especially that photo that we showed earlier, the to me the launch of our exhibition at the National Museum is that watershed moment as an organization. That it represents two things in particular when it comes to Action Klima Pilipinas' work, especially vis-a-vis those past 5 years, including the pandemic era. Number one, uh, it basically means that, uh, at least from our internal assessment, we have rebuilt the network as it is. I suppose we can discuss more about more of what really Action Klima does later on. But I think the other thing that it represents that's more relevant to our conversation is that it represents new frontiers that climate action itself in the Philippines must undertake. And while, of course, museums play an important role in disseminating education and other kinds of information, especially the Natural History Museum itself, it disseminates climate information. They have wonderful exhibits on biodiversity, on renewable energy, on minerals, on marine ecosystems, among countless others. uh, we really need to emphasize more the message of more urgent, accelerated, and inclusive climate action. And that's why in our exhibition at the National Museum, and CK mentioned the term katumbalikwasad. We did not invent that term. That is a term that's actually first used by a late great environmentalist in the Philippines named Miguel Magala. He's a former councilor in the province of Marinduque, and he coined that term a few years after Yolanda or Haiyan, the super typhoon struck the Philippines. And it's actually an amalgamation of multiple Tagalog words, katumbas, kalikasan, balik. They all tie to the concept of resilience. And what that exhibition wants to do is to redefine resilience. And I suppose, again, we're going to talk about that more later on, but uh, that's that's the kind of watershed moment that I think is not only relevant to the story of the network itself, but also in terms of what the future uh, playing field for climate action in the Philippines would look like.
Wonderful. And there's actually a lot of info to take in there, JL. And such a noble goal that Action Klima Pilipinas has, especially being able to unite all of these 40 members and counting into one shared goal of accelerating climate action, because it's urgent. I mean, we already see the impacts on the ground, and we don't have a lot of time. Just referencing the SDGs, we're only 5 years away from meeting the targets, and that's just really the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of like the metrics that we're also looking out for, and a lot of like the indicators that are also important for us to consider. And so, this is where, as you mentioned, changing landscape. There's a changing landscape, and now collective action is much more is becoming more and more necessary these days. And talking about the collective action, and also we'll go back to you, JL, and talk more about your initiatives. I'd like to pan this back to Daniel, and let's talk about your first community mapping sessions. You already floated the idea that you worked with um, stakeholders and a local community, and also Ateneo grade school. Now, in these first community mapping sessions, what was it like to sit down with all of the staff and hear their climate stories? Because, as you already mentioned, they're not usually represented in big data sets. Were there any moments where someone shared something that completely shifted how you perceived and understood climate risk?
Yeah, thanks for panning the discussion back to the community mapping. So the community CDRA that we conducted had many different parts, and the community mapping is really just one part of the whole participatory process and approach. We had one part of the process that was really just talking about the idea of the climate action plan, why we were reaching out to them, why them in particular. We didn't just, pick their names randomly from a hat, but it's really because of the existing BERT and BEAT system, but also emphasizing that we were really just there to listen to their anecdotes and their experiences And I think very importantly, we weren't there to add to their work, almost like a listening campaign. We really had to emphasize why their inputs are important. It was also important for us to let them know that we are giving them this platform to give those inputs. Now, at the risk of complicating the discussion, I think it's also important for me to mention that AIS also manages the Philippine hub of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity, and we've worked with JL for My Climate Risk. And My Climate Risk is basically an interdisciplinary project under the World Climate Research Program, and its aims are to develop and mainstream bottom-up approach to climate risk. So we can see where these are in this discussion. And you know what Patrick shared earlier really resonated with me, that everyone is a designer because it's an innate part of us to create and to problem solve. So part of this approach to mainstream a bottom-up approach is the recognition that expertise is diffuse. So what does this mean? It means that we recognize that stakeholders are everywhere and stakeholders are experts. So it's not just the climate scientists, it's not just the climate model makers. Stakeholders know their situation best. And because we recognize that expertise is diffuse, therefore stakeholders are everywhere, therefore everyone is technically an expert. So any plan that claims to be as comprehensive or as far-reaching as a climate action plan must have their in it. And so to return to the topic of the community mapping, what we did was to flash the map of the risk zones, and you flashed a photo earlier of one of the sessions where we did that. That was for the higher education cluster Luert. And we also handed out printed copies of the maps to the participants from the Luerts and Beats. And basically, we asked them to tell us where they experience, the impacts of extreme heat, the impacts of flooding, and the impacts of strong winds, and how these are experienced. What does the building damage look like, if any? How does vegetation around them change seasonally? Are there members of the building population that are more vulnerable to these different impacts? And because the university has such a large and diverse population, there is what we call differential vulnerability among these different groups. Basically, different people being more or less likely to be at risk. As to the last part of your question, it's a bit difficult to pinpoint an exact moment that really shifted how I understand, climate risk in our setting, because we really went into the exercise knowing that there would be a few surprises that we would learn along the way. But perhaps the biggest surprise for me wasn't a specific anecdote or experience. It was generally how willing people were to participate in the process. It's sort of sharing a bit about AIS history. I think we've really gone through a huge shift in how our stakeholders, how our publics think about climate action and sustainability. I've been with the institute for almost 4 years now, but I would hear from my colleagues who, were really here since the institute was founded, that they used to have such a time involving people in sustainability and climate action initiatives, because people would usually operate under the assumption that, oh, sustainability, climate action, that's for the science majors, that's for the that's for the academic departments and then when you go to people from these departments, they would say, oh, that's not really for us, that's just for the environmental science department. And then when you go to the environmental science department, you might hear people say, oh, maybe that's not us. Maybe that's, people from the social sciences, because sustainability is also about, economic well-being. So in contrast to before, where people were, fighting, not really fighting over, but rather arguing why they shouldn't be the focal point for sustainability, now people are excited to be a part of the process. And that's really a huge motivating factor for, how we can mainstream this bottom-up approach to climate risk.
Yeah, and one thing that stood out to me is when you mentioned stakeholders are everywhere, and you know, I think you saying about people from across expertise and designations would sort of like pass on the responsibility to another. I think that's really just really the lack of perhaps the understanding that all of us have a play in this, have a part to play, and that, a climate mapping session, for example, is something that could really open our eyes to what our role is, even though it's just really really and even in our day-to-day actions can also be a factor to a lot of like the climate risks that are sort of like snowballing, as the as it starts from just little tasks that maybe we don't mind doing but may be harmful for the environment, now snowballed altogether with other people's wrongdoings that they really don't understand, and now you have this big issue. And so, putting everyone together, putting them in the room, giving them like the mechanism to understand, okay, what are our vulnerabilities and how can we work together as a unit, is something that really helps everybody to get on board and understand what their role is. Now, um, let's now pan this conversation to something a little deeper. And now, all of you mentioned your journey and how you started and how your flagship programs emerged from simple drafts to now really effective programs and mechanisms that enable a lot of communities and institutions. Now let's talk about the reality check, and this is where we cover or we explore perhaps some of like the bumps in the road, because not all journey is smooth, and I would actually argue that all journey has bumps along the way, and that you are probably planning for something a little, more, I would say, optimistic, and then you're now encountered with these challenges, and now how you were able to overcome them. And now I'd like to start this part of the discussion with JL, specifically talking about their initiative to make or basically champion a whole of society approach where no one is left behind, and that's specifically something that you're really very very enthusiastic and serious about. Now, in practice, for you, who are the people who have been left behind in the Philippine climate governance, and what changes what changes when you intentionally center them in the conversation?
Allow me to begin my response to that question by highlighting this. Ideally, when we talk about no one is left behind, we're talking about, for example, 110 plus million Filipinos in this country alone, for example, and accounting for millions of OFWs as well. Of course, in practice, no single organization can literally engage with every single 110 plus million within a year, 10 years, unless they have no lives whatsoever. But that's beside the point. But that's why it's very important that to overcome not just the conflict between the urgency of addressing not just climate action in general, but any development issue when you think about it, and the logistical constraints that any single entity would face when it comes to trying to meaningfully get everyone involved. And that's where the importance of partnerships, collaborations, and meaningful representation would come into play. And when we say meaningful representation, we're not just talking about Congress. We're also talking about how non-government actors like ourselves here in this podcast would be involved and will do within our respective capacities to best represent the the voices, the needs and concerns of the most vulnerable sectors and communities. And CK, when we talk about who are the people who have been left behind, uh, well, let's start. There's a bunch of groups and sectors that we can mention for hours here, but just to enumerate, let's start with, for example, indigenous peoples. And I think the concerns and needs of indigenous peoples probably are more overlooked or ignored than any other marginalized group, probably in the Philippines or anywhere else in the world, quite frankly. Then we also talk about the needs of children and youth as well. I mean, literally half of the country's population is children and youth. And I think that also includes every single person that's podcast. I think so. But At the same time, how are they supposed to be represented? Are the Sangguniang Kabataan groups, is that enough of a system? Uh, but outside of that particular space in the governance system of the Philippines, how else will children youth get involved? Through the National Youth Commission? Or the point I'm trying to make here is sometimes, again, we're talking about literally half of the Philippine population. And the concerns of children and youth are often either ignored or taken as tokenistic when it comes to inclusion in inputs in a lot of decision making processes. Of course, the other big one will be women in particular. uh, Inherently, the needs of women, climate wise, are very much different from men. And women, generally speaking, are more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. But when you look at how decisions are made in the Philippines, for example, when it comes to, let's say, disaggregated data, just to make sure that when you look at, for example, in a particular agricultural community, what are the needs of women who are in the agricultural sector? Because their roles are can be defined also by the environment they grew up in. And sometimes women are also expected to play certain, at least in the Philippine context, there's still a lot of cases where they still play traditional gender roles as well. So there are these particular factors that we acknowledge, but when it comes to data or decision making, they're not as included as we expect it to be. And of course, we can also mention, I guess, in the under the Philippine law, we can call them basic sectors. So every single one of these basic sectors under the Philippine law are also the most vulnerable groups and in sectors and communities in the Philippines. So persons with disabilities, senior citizens, farmers, fisherfolk, and countless others. So these are the people that are often left behind in climate governance. And what changes when we intentionally center them in the conversation, especially in the policymaking space, is that it gives climate change the human dimension. And if you look at what Patrick has mentioned when it comes to what ACTA does, of course, what Daniel has mentioned as well, with what AIS does, with the communities as well that they work with, it's always important to not just look into the numbers. It's not enough to simply have that technocratic paradigm as we use in the as framed in the Laudato Si, for example, because when you look at a lot of the decision making process, and for us who monitor closely how the government makes decisions or makes policies, and some in the government actually even has admitted this for the record that in some of the decisions they made, they only look at the numbers, they only look at the technical side. And while there's, of course, numbers are important, but what about the qualitative aspect? What about the moral, the ethical, social, and cultural aspects, which are honestly missing? And the one policy that was actually mentioned in particular is actually one of the most important climate commitments of the Philippines, the Nationally Determined Contribution, or the NDC. So, just for the benefit of our audience, the NDC of the Philippines is simply its self-determined commitment to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, and it's within our respective capacity. And government representatives have mentioned this when they developed that NDC CK, even back in the pandemic. Actually, it was submitted to the UN back in the pandemic. Our target to reduce emissions. They admitted it. It was all numbers, not a lot on the social side. So simply placing or bringing to the table the needs and concerns, the voices, the photos, the lived experiences, cases of how children and youth want to be involved in this process, how the victims of the climate disasters, for example, their concerns must also be, especially when it comes to, let's say, relocation or disaster prevention. These are the voices that must be there because you know, the government caters a lot, to be honest with you, as well to, let's say, the private sector. But we all know what the bottom line of the private sector is. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, in terms of what the private sector does, there, what the point we're trying to make here is there, just to quote Star Trek, I guess, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So for us, that's why it's important to put the needs and concerns of the people and the planet. If not in an equal space, definitely above the one for profit, especially a for profit should be above that. And that's also defined under our sustainable development goals. So for us, ECK, it's about bringing that human side that really spurs more accelerated climate action.
I love that. I love that. And I love everything that you're saying, JL. And I also really appreciate you for identifying the different groups of people and different peoples that are also neglected in at least even at the very basic conversations on climate leadership and climate adaptation and resilience. And I guess this is also where Alter Cup 30 Philippines really comes in and becoming a more grassroots type of event that brings together people from across cultures, across dimensions, across genders, and all of the classifications and identifications. Because I think for the most part, and also based from my experience, a lot of conferences, events out there are have been really focused or have only been accessible to people who can get there, can join. Basically, people who have money, people who have education, or maybe some connections who can actually bring them there, and even the geographic location also even matters because given that we're here in Metro Manila, so like a lot of the happenings, the hustle and bustle are happening here. But you also think about how about the people who are in the far flung areas who are also often hit by climate-induced disasters. And so I love that you mentioned all of that and them being part of the conversation. And now I'd like to pan the next question to Daniel because this is also where what JL mentioned comes in vulnerability. A lot of these people have different vulnerability, and through your community CDRAS, you discovered that differential vulnerability across university population exists as well. Can you help us understand what that means in practice and who bears the greatest climate risks on campus? And what does this reveal about climate change or how climate change amplifies existing inequalities?
Yeah. Thanks, CK. It's really interesting that you point out the term differential vulnerability. I first came across this term from a publication by Dr. Declan Conway and his co-authors. It was a paper that was basically about the need for bottom-up assessments of climate risks. Now, when we talk about differential vulnerability, we can dissect that into its two component terms just to make it more digestible. So let's start with vulnerability. This refers to qualities that might increase the negative impacts of hazards that a population experiences. And the differential, which is, the qualifier of vulnerability, the differential part comes in when we look at how this is unequal across a very diverse population. And in the context of the Ateneo being a Jesuit university and a university that has a basic education cluster, the Ateneo has students who are minors, okay, from the grade school to the junior high school and the senior high school. But it's also home to Jesuit priests who are past retirement age. Okay, so you have a population that has both extremes. You have the very young and also those who are past retirement age, and these two extremes are really the segments of the population that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate hazards. So when you think about these climate hazards, these include the health impacts that come with heat waves, for example. These are the risks that come with, let's say, flooding events. It's much harder to, let's say, mobilize these two extremes when we have to evacuate, for example. Okay, and so that showed up in the risk map that we came up with, where both the grade school and the Jesuit residents had significantly higher risk scores than, say, the higher education cluster, or especially when you compare them against risk zones that don't really have high foot traffic. And so I guess that was one thing that sort of surprised us, but at the same time, we sort of expected that the scores would come out that way. Just, having all of that, having the scores translate into a map with the color grades and the extremes really makes it feel a bit jarring. And so we know that climate change increases the severity of the disasters that affect us. But and we also know that some subgroups of the population, those who are more vulnerable because of age, because of health, because of where they stay, or several other factors, some of these subgroups and where they stay might need more help in terms of enabling policy to build up their resilience. And so the imperative to work on both climate mitigation and adaptation is really not just to solve a wide-reaching problem of, the climate crisis writ large, but also to address the different impacts, the differential vulnerability that is really felt unequally. And this is where the concept of climate justice comes in. And perhaps this is where JL can have a bit more to say about climate justice, which is really another really huge topic that might take us hours to dissect.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's it's really nice that you also pointed out that there are two extremes in the campuses, and I guess that also sort of puts everything in perspective, and especially as you sort of synthesize all of like your findings into one verifiable result, really helps your organization also uh, take the next step, the necessary step, with better information and better decisions. And so, talking about community mapping and talking about designing, now I'd like to pan the next question to Patrick. And from your design workshops, you differentiate between design problems with clear fixes and wicked problems like climate change that require multi-stakeholder collaboration. When you're working with communities, what are the moments when people realize the challenge they're facing is interconnected with systems they hadn't considered before?
Thank you, CK. I realized before I start with my next intervention that I think I should also explain what the 3-0 is. I failed to mention that in my earlier sharing, but the 3-0 is essentially and why we're called the 3-0 house. It's basically to tackle, I would say, the general goals or the SDGs that we've kind of simplified into three, which is basically zero poverty, zero exclusion, and zero carbon. And so this conversation would fall under like a zero carbon related initiative. So but yes, I think to answer your question, well, I think we also just need to quickly give in a nutshell what design thinking is because some of our viewers and our listeners might not be too familiar with that. And design thinking is essentially a perspective or paradigm that has evolved over the years through the intersection of art and engineering, with the goal of solving problems through a human-centered approach that is grounded on empathy and also iteration. No? So if we are familiar with global leaders like IDEO and the Design Thinking Foundation, I forget the name of the organization, they basically boil down the design thinking process into empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. No, and then this particular process basically follows that if let's say we have a chair and then there's a certain customer, like let's take an old person, they don't like this chair because the chair is too big or too tall, and let's say the elderly person is quite short of stature, so they have a hard time getting on the chair. So that's a design problem and a preference specific to that person. And design thinking just tells you to listen to that elderly person and just make the chair smaller, which is a technical fix. It's a technical uh, action that designers can take to produce the next chair. And so you've solved that problem for that particular user, no? But what we're saying with climate change, you cannot uh, proceed that way, no? You can't say that people can wait for designers to present a solution because climate change is happening now. It takes a while to build a chair, but people can't wait like weeks for I mean, yes, there certain solutions will need to be built out over the long term for more to be more effective. But that said, there also at the same time needs to be already actions taken now, small actions in order to start addressing the problem. So the wicked problem, just to also quickly define what this is, it's basically a certain type of social challenge that cannot be solved or addressed by one single solution or by one single person. It's systemic. So essentially, what we're saying in these workshops. So if I may also hint at the design thinking workshops that you mentioned that we do in the 30 house, what we're saying is that design thinking is not enough. Design thinking in this process, uh, designers produce a certain commodity or an object. They present it to the buyer or the consumer, and then the consumer only then gives feedback about how usable it is or how effective it is. But we're saying in a wicked problem type situation, a wicked problem is not only experienced by one person, it's experienced by everyone. Climate change happens on a global scale, and that's why we're saying it takes communities to work with each other to co-design not just one solution but several solutions at all at once. So I'm very happy that people like AIS and Action Klima are taking these different collaborative approaches, because that is essentially need in order to tackle climate change. And so I guess to just start wrapping up and to answer your question, when we do these workshops, no CK, I think people have to understand that the problem is not isolated. No, when we make these distinctions between you having a design preference for commodity versus a social problem, it is not only you that you're facing it, but it's also a whole community. No, it takes the both the users, or I guess those who uh, would benefit from the solution, and the design experts to collaborate together at the start of the process, to know what solutions are important and to actually iterate. No, one last piece I want to contribute here is that the solution is not a done deal once it's produced. You have to iterate, because climate change evolves, the conditions evolve, and so we have to adapt our solutions as well to these evolving conditions. And I think I'll pause there, because essentially our workshops are based on that premise.
Mhm. Now, I'd like to point out one specific thing that you also mentioned, because when you mentioned wicked problem, I think it sounded something I read from a book by Don Norman, The Design of Everyday Things. But it's actually something that I read as sort of like a reference when I started out my journey into design thinking, because I myself I did design thinking, or I even do design thinking even until now for the programs that I do also, and I think that's sort of like my starter resource, or my gateway essentially into design thinking. And I think I can't really remember the exact definition that was given there, but essentially wicked problems are problems that are too painful to ignore, and that they should be addressed because they're not as simple as perhaps fine tuning a nook in a cranny or something, or maybe just like loosening up a boat or something, or it's not as easy as that. And I think that also, when you put it in in that context, in a bigger scale, where we're now dealing with climate problems and climate issues, then you now see that it perfectly aligns with your definition of wicked problems, Patrick. And this is really where collective action comes in. And so, talking about collective action, that's actually a perfect segue to the next part of our conversation. We've already covered the road bumps, as I mentioned earlier. Now let's talk about the evolution of your immediate solutions from you know uh, Action Klima Pilipinas starting Katumbalikwasan, as it recovered from the pandemic, with AIS when it started with these climate mapping sessions, now to a bigger action plan, and also with 30 House from doing enablement activities in different programs, into now sort of like um defining co-designing as a like a flagship program that encompasses a lot of like the things that you do and also captures the values that you uphold. Now, let's start with you, JL. um, you've been across the world. You've been in touch with a lot of people, different networks. You've joined COP29. You've even joined Bonn Climate Conference, and you've, from your experience being, from different parts of the world and engaging with a lot of stakeholders, you have built this network that spans different sectors, communities, and regions. What have you learned about what makes collective action actually scale? And what are the conditions that need to exist for local initiatives to connect and amplify each other?
To begin answering that question, CK, I would like to reference a photo that we that was taken from, as you mentioned, COP29 back in Baku in Azerbaijan. And during that particular conference, one of the activities that we did as Action Klima, because normally under the climate negotiations for the past few years, I've basically been running point for all national level CSOs when it comes to coordination in the from the Philippines rather. And one of the things that we always try to do is we try to maximize our space. And this photo right here took place last November last year when we had a dialogue with lawmakers from the Philippines, our representatives in Congress who were also in attendance at the sidelines of COP29. And we gave everyone a debriefing about loss and damage at this moment because by this point in time, the Philippines was about to host its first board meeting of the Loss and Damage Fund since being named the board host, which happened the next month after COP29. And uh, the lady in the middle is Congresswoman Ana Veloso Tuazon from the province of Leyte, which of course was practically ground zero for Super Typhoon Haiyan 11 years ago from this particular moment. And why am I showing this picture? Because simply bringing everyone together in this kind of space is a rarity in itself. And as you can see me blabbering on about whatever I was talking about there, I was also surrounded by we were surrounded rather by some of our colleagues from the youth sector here. The man sitting next to my left actually was with me when we both attended that particular Loss and Damage Fund board meeting the month after COP29. And then the other two to the left of Congresswoman Anna Duazon, one of them is from actually the medical sector, from the health sector in particular, who's also active in the global youth activities, and the other one was a one of the delegates from the Philippines that was also under a fellowship when it comes to climate finance. So just bringing everyone together in the same space to enable a conversation does matter because it enables uh, that environment of inclusivity. Because at least for myself, because it's part of my job, I get to talk to lawmakers quite a bit, but that's more of a privilege for me because I'm sure there's a lot of other people in my line of work, in my generation, who would also love to have that same opportunity. So it's important for us to make sure that that people get to maximize these kinds of opportunities. And uh, to me, that's one of the key points for how you make collective action scale. Sometimes CK it just comes down to bringing people together, and because there's, as they say, there you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and we need to get uh, a lot of climate advocates, especially from different sectors, a lot of opportunities, and let's see what we can bring from there. And actually, this particular meeting has been very productive as well, not just for Action Klima, but also in terms of building our partnership with Philippine Congress, members of the Philippine Congress when it comes to advancing climate justice, accountability, and addressing loss and damage. And then, regarding your other question about uh, conditions to exist for local initiatives to connect, I think that is one of the problems as well, CK, that we actually have realized in the past couple of months. And going back again to the loss and damage theme, uh, when I went to Cebu last July, this was the day again after the another board meeting of the Loss and Damage Fund. I visited. CSOs, people's organizations, and even some representatives of local DRRM offices in the province of Cebu, because that's where the board meeting was. So obviously, I wanted to report to them what happened during that board meeting, because they are the supposed beneficiaries of of those particular funds to avoid more extreme climate impacts that are now going increasingly beyond capacities for adaptation, which is what loss and damage is basically about. I know when we it was reported recently in the news as well, CK, about there's now a tipping point that has been crossed in the climate space, which is now coral reefs probably are going to a lot of them are probably
Mhm.
going to be bleached out and potentially die out as well, and that's never a good thing, obviously. So I went to visit those particular groups, and the very first question I asked them, CK, is you're here. There's a lot of national climate level developments in the Philippines, as I mentioned earlier. You're updating your NDC. We're about to be the second country in the world to have a national just transition framework. There's a lot of things happening at the national level. I asked them point blank, how many of you have heard of any of these national level developments? You know how many people raised their hands? None. No one raised their hands whatsoever. The next question I asked, how many of them are familiar that there was even a loss and damage fund board meeting happening literally less than 1 hour from the venue of the board meeting to the venue of that meeting I had with the CSOs and POs and the others? Only one person raised their hand. And to me, that is a moment of epiphany that, sure, you've heard of it before from stories of members of Action Klima and our other partners, but how can they be national level climate developments if the people you're supposed to serve, the people who are supposed to benefit from these plans, most especially, don't even know about them? And to me, this is, I think, a good example of how to answer that question about what needs to exist for local initiatives to connect and amplify each other. It's as simple as sometimes as them knowing that they exist, that these initiatives exist. And I think that's another problem that we need to emphasize in this particular episode, moving forward as well with the others. There's a lot of things that are being done by different stakeholders. What Action Team is doing, what Daniel and AIS are doing, what Patrick and Active is doing. Of course, we all work together at some points, but you can't say the same for the other groups that may be doing something similar, but they're just not that familiar with it. And I think if you look at how the government also reports or tracks climate projects, as wide, ideally speaking, as wide of an infrastructure as the government has, they miss out on a lot of things too. You can put it down sometimes to a lack of policy, a lack of technology, or sometimes just lack of political will. But I think we should stop taking the importance of simply being aware and simply knowing for granted. Because I think sometimes when it comes to simple communication, information dissemination, education especially, I think those are being taken for granted in the climate space. So for me, it comes down to simply sometimes, notwithstanding issues of finance or technologies or anything like that, because they're also important. But sometimes it comes down to simply knowing and being aware that they exist.
Yeah, I love that you said that. And I mean, just for starters, a lot of people are considered invisible in the Philippines. For example, if we just plainly talk about financial inclusion, we there are people who we consider unbanked, for example, and they're the ones who are usually neglected in the process because they don't have formal documents to represent them and that they're real people. And just aligning that with with the with what you said, and um, them being involved in action just really starts with recognizing that they exist and that they're also part of the community, and that they too have, as I mentioned earlier, have a role to play. Really uh, starts or kickstarts that empowerment approach, that we're giving them an avenue for them to also advocate for their needs, because first and foremost they'll be most concerned about their safety in in all of the climate induced events that will be happening from here on out. And from there they can also start thinking about, okay, well, if I feel that I'm threatened by the upcoming typhoon, then will my other neighbors feel as well? How them also experiencing the same thing? How vulnerable are they too? And so that brings everyone together, and that gives that like that forms a unified understanding that whatever is facing us is something that's real, that's significant, and that has to be acted on together. And so um now this is also perfectly segues the the next the next question, and this is for you, Daniel. And we've touched on the well JL. He was building networks and communities from across the Philippines, and now you started from the community mapping session, and now you've already elevated to um, doing or formulating a climate action plan that's comprehensive for the entire university, and you're also preparing for public consultations. How do you maintain that community driven approach while scaling up to institutional policy? What mechanisms are you building to ensure that the voices from those focus group discussions that you did, and even from personal conversations that you had also with the different stakeholders and mapping sessions actually shape the final plan and aren't just tokenized?
Yeah, I mean, you touch on a very important point here. The tokenism is really it's really a huge problem that we need to overcome whenever we, try to espouse this ethic of a bottom-up approach. And so it's easy to change the way that these plans are made. The way that we created the climate action plan could have gone a very different route. It could have looked a very different way. But given how, they're guided by both top-down directives, top-down data management, we also need to be humble enough to recognize the importance of bottom-up data generation before we even think about, data management, and also bottom-up governance mechanisms. I mentioned the word humble because it's important for us to work, in the climate and sustainability space. It's important for us to realize, especially as researchers, that whenever we go into a community or interact with stakeholder groups, oftentimes we carry with us an inherent privilege of an outsider or of an expert, and that can immediately affect the power balance. And so I like to use the term epistemic humility when I talk about this. I know it's it might be a big word. So when I talk about this, I feel like it captures the notion that we as researchers need to recognize that other forms of knowledge and expertise are valid, and that they can complement and even enrich the traditional models, the figures, the graphs and reports that we interact with. And that's the epistemic part, the knowledge part. Recognizing this validity and then making space for these other forms of knowledge is the humility part. And this is a quality that I think is very important because, we in academia, we talk a good game about, stakeholder participation, stakeholder engagement, bottom up approaches, but living that out and actually making that translate from nice words on paper to actual movement on the ground, those are two very different things. And so this is what really guided the participatory processes in the formation of the climate action plan thus far. And it's also informed the way that we shape the proposed initiatives. So, for example, the information that we gathered from our stakeholders and from other risk maps, because we do also complement, what we learn from our stakeholders with the existing data from government agencies. You know, let's say, for example, the anecdotes and the anecdotes on flooding, flood currents, and flood risk maps. These can inform where we would recommend certain nature-based solutions to be placed for maximum, effectivity. Because we also need to be smart about the resources that we use for these climate action initiatives. Another way that we're trying to avoid that tokenism is looking beyond the public consultations and the presentations and really looking into the long-term life cycle of the climate action plan, we're building in mechanisms for bottom-up governance approaches in the plan's updating provisions. uh, we're proposing, that we can convene stakeholders for any future amendments or updates to the plan. And this is not something that's optional. We're trying to propose that this should be, an institutionalized step, that any, big changes, any amendments should go through, this network of peers. I can't say much more than this at this point, but we are very intentional with, baking these mechanisms in, especially when we first drafted the provisions. We really wanted to lay it down that this should have a bottom up approach, not just in the creation, but also in the, the longer lifespan of the plan, because we recognize that the weight of any document like an institutional climate action plan um, carries with it, the responsibility to reflect the voices of the community. And because we recognize how much more enriched these documents can be if we have that participatory science from the ground up. And this approach to science goes back to what I mentioned earlier on epistemic humility, where we give significant weight to both conventional forms of knowledge and inputs from our publics and from our stakeholders. So this approach thus tries to avoid, the tokenism, and tries to build in mechanisms for genuine participation, co-production, and down the line co-ownership.
Wonderful. And such a thorough approach that you're taking here. And I really love how, the engagement with stakeholders really goes beyond the drafting of the plan itself. And to me, it looks like it's semi decentralized, because although you are this big body of scholars who are taking care of the plan and making sure that you monitor it and that it's implemented really well. You have these stakeholders who you consult with for anything that needs to be changed. Should you need to adjust your approach, or should something needs to be amended, just so it also fits the context of, because I mean, plans always change, things always change, there's always change. I mean, after death and taxes, one thing constant in life is change, right? And I love that a lot of your stakeholders are still involved in the process, um, from start to finish. And actually, it's a cycle, what it seems like. And now, for Patrick, well, I I see that you also work with a lot of communities with your by when you do your workshops, and these communities really vary. And you touch base with a lot of groups, and even community leaders to get this enacted. What patterns have you noticed about which co-design solutions stick and which ones fade after people leave the workshop? This is oftentimes perhaps one of like the most common dilemma in running a workshop. Like, people would learn something, and then when they leave, then they forget about it, and then they live on with their lives and as if they didn't attend the workshop. Now, how do you build that shared ownership that makes all of these solutions sustainable?
Thanks for that, CK. I think just to also give a bit of context before I answer that, just quickly, in these workshops, we basically teach what we call the 3-0 house co-design framework, which is essentially connect, unleash, innovate. And what we mean by this is it's also based on a very interesting book I read by Ezio Manzini. It's closely related also. I think this framework that we follow. He says that the innovation, for innovation to happen, there are three elements that are key. So the first is the critical aspect. So basically acknowledging that this reality exists and that status quo cannot be maintained, and that we have to address a real urgent problem. The second piece is the creative aspect, no? So understanding that this is our reality, acknowledging that we have this reality, we now have to find ways to do what hasn't been done yet, to basically explore new and fresh ways of thinking and solving problems. And the third aspect is the practical. Essentially, uh, we can't live in a bubble and say we can implement all of these things. We have to choose, be strategic with which solutions we decide to experiment and move forward with. And that's how we basically also teach the Connect, Unleash, Innovate style also in connecting. We basically gather people, we understand no, these are the realities of our time, and that we have to uh, face these problems. We have to agree on facing these problems collectively. Another aspect after that, so having understood the critical aspect of that, we now move to the creative, where we actually try to hold a free, I would say, a psychologically safe space for people to think freely and to ideate as many no, not problems, as many solutions as they can think of that haven't been done yet uh, by society. So, and I just also want to quickly point out the two things that JL and Daniel were mentioning now, that uh, we have to make space for people who aren't usually part of the conversation. Also, JL was mentioning these basic sectors that often get neglected. Daniel mentions that we have to exercise this epistemic humility in order to be, I guess, more comprehensive and wholesome in our approach. And we do in the unleash aspect also acknowledge that everyone is a designer. Your specific story and expertise is important in the to bring to the table, and we want to use that collectively for the good of everyone. No? And then the last aspect is innovate. No, we basically narrow down out of all of the problems. Sorry, I keep saying problems. Out of all the solutions that we've co-ideated, and then see which one sticks and which one is the best to continue sustaining and scaling. So to answer your question, no, I would say that there are lots of solutions that come from this workshop that we've been experimenting with and have rolled out for a while. And I would say that not a lot of them really stay for too long because, of course, people also have their own resources and priorities. And I would say that not all of them are quite 100% serious in really, following or committing to that co-design solution. What I can say, however, what sticks is the behavior, the behavior change, and this is what we're after when we do each of these workshops. No, it's this shift mentally to be able to go through this conversation, this process, and then to make sure to go back to it, to reiterate. No, and I'm happy that Daniel also mentioned this example of amending. No, we have to be open to be amend what we're doing every time, and we also have to be flexible, or in JL's case, no, he says to adapt, because if we adapt each time we build on this specific solution that we've designed together, then it gets better. No, it's just a matter. It can even just be one person who remembers this co-design solution and then gets back to another person and says, this idea. We tested it, and I think we're ready to try it again. Why not? And I think that's also proof of like the behavior change in some way. No, and that's why I think, and so to wrap up my intervention for this question, it's basically we're after behavior change, and we want to see that behavior change stick and continue to grow among the people who attend our workshops for the 30 House.
Yeah, such a wonderful goal because it isn't easy definitely to influence behavior change, especially when people have been used to certain patterns already. And that's why, for example, in corporate speak we have change management, right? Because when you implement or enact change, oftentimes there would be pushbacks because people will be like, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But then they don't really see that that is really the case because maybe on the surface surface it looks okay, but then deep down it's not. And even for maybe for some people, change is also painful because they have to let go of certain patterns that made them, comfortable with whatever their routine is. And so, a lot of these things have to change. And so, but I guess we can rest in the fact that we have a shared goal, and that our goal is for everyone's sake, and that whatever is maybe being compromised for now is really for the greater good of everybody. And so, gentlemen, we're almost at time. I actually have more questions for you, but then time didn't permit us to converse much longer. Perhaps we can do a part two of this or maybe something else. But definitely our listeners would be able to catch you in Alter Cop 30 Philippines. But before I get ahead of myself, I actually have one last question for all three of you. And this is an excellent way for us to cap this conversation. Now, let's look at like the bigger picture and like the broader vision and the transformation that we're after. You're all enabling communities to become catalysts for change through participatory planning, co-design thinking, and whole of society approaches. If collective action for climate became the norm rather than the exception in the Philippines, what does that regenerative future actually look like? How do communities, institutions, and networks work together differently than they do today? How about I throw this question first to Patrick, since you're the last to respond, and then we go to Daniel and JL last.
Thanks, CK. Something that I like to think about also at times, though I rarely verbalize it, no, is if climate can change, then why can't we? So I think somehow this also points to a future that I hope where we can, as a society, be more open to change. I hope it's a good kind of change. No, it's a change that actually leads to this regenerative future that you're seeing, CK. No, but I think it's basically a bigger openness to change and to be able to adapt, to iterate, in order to continue improving. And hopefully, those conversations are inclusive of the people who need to be in the room. So, both on the public sector, on the private sector, and also the basic sectors, has been mentioned earlier. And somehow, I think it's also just for us to continue having these conversations. No, because if the conversation stops, then that's going to be a bad thing. So we need to keep talking. So I think I'll pause there.
Okay, Daniel.
Wow, such a to end the session. I'll shift from my perspective um, from the university to the country. If we look at our country's history, specifically on different strategies of environment management, we can sort
We
of
probably
colonial
oh,
and Commonwealth periods, during the Marcos dictatorship, to more bottom-up approaches.
yeah, you were cut off a bit. Sorry about that. Could you like backtrack to the past 10 seconds and just repeat your point?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I
Sorry,
guess I'll just
yeah, it
shift
happens.
perspective here a bit
Yeah.
from the university to the country. Yeah. And if we look at our country's history, specifically strategies of environmental management that we've experimented with, sort of pick out different points in our history where we've experimented with top-down approach, command and control during, the colonial period, the Commonwealth period, and even the Marcos dictatorship. And then there are other periods where we've experimented with bottom-up approaches, like during the Magsaysay period, or community-based models during the Ramos period. And one might argue that it's actually the community-based model that shows the most success. Going back to your question to Patrick earlier about ownership, it's literally in the name. It's community-based. And so I say this pointing to examples like community-based forest management programs, which not only try to address climate mitigation through environmental stewardship, but also poverty alleviation. And therefore, they're trying to address that differential vulnerability that I explained earlier. When I biodiversity and terrestrial ecosystems, I like to discuss the National Greening Program in my lectures, and how much potential it has to address, all the different pillars of sustainability, and thus work towards both climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. Now, if I go back to speaking from my original perspective as, someone working in a university, collective action also looks like knowing that we can leverage on each other's experiences and expertise. One happy realization that we had with the campus mapping was that we also realized we could actually share maps with other offices. For example, the facilities management office was set to conduct a drainage audit right around we were conducting our community CIDRA. So the inputs from the community CIDRA sessions that we had in hand were very useful as an important data point for their office. And so this way we're strengthening climate adaptation by collaborating closely with other offices too, and not just the direct stakeholders. So sorry to ramble, but this is basically a very long setup to my answer that a regenerative future is one driven by epistemic humility. Pardon the very cheesy line, but this is where humility gives one, collective governance, and two, participatory science. And in this paradigm, we recognize not only that expertise is diffuse, but we also demystify the idea of science, democratize climate action and make it all less intimidating. Make people feel like they can contribute and not just the scientists, not just the experts. And this is really important as a foundation, I think, because this is such a wicked problem as Patrick was alluding to earlier. And it requires all hands on deck. My mentor, Dr. Charlotte Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, once said, sustainability is not a competition, but a collaboration. So I guess a regenerative future is really that kind of approach.
Yeah. Can I repeat what you just said? Because for some reason, Daniel, I think it got muffled. You said uh, sustainability is not competition, but a collaboration.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, no notes, nothing further to add. Now, JL, you're the last, also, but not the least.
To help start this brief answer to that questions, well, to those questions, I'd like to show one more photo, which is this photo that was taken from the past climate conference in Germany last, when was it, June? Yeah, earlier June this year. Basically, the halftime COP, as I would call it. So what this shows you are the Philippine civil society delegates during the climate conference, and the one thing that immediately stands out from this particular picture is that every single person that is intended to be part of that shot are youth. And well, there's one person there that technically is not, but she looks younger than me, so it doesn't really matter. The point is, um, I think this is a glimpse of what the future of climate advocacy in the Philippines looks like. And they represent different sectors. Some of them are from the Manila Observatory. Some of them are from this youth group in Negros. Some of them represent indigenous peoples directly. Some of them are experts in climate finance and agriculture. It's a very diverse mix of young people that are now being increasingly relied on for their expertise to engage in these kinds of decision making processes at this kind particular level. And the reason why I want to show this is it simply shows that the sustainability aspect of climate work is very important when we want, if and when we achieve a regenerative future. Because we always talk about sustainability in a substantive sense, as we should. We talk about sustainable development. We always anchor climate with sustainable development goals. It's SDG 13. But what about the procedural aspect? How do we sustain everything that we have
Mm-hmm.
done
Mm-hmm.
for the past decades, from the previous generations that came before us to my generation, to Daniel's generation, to Patrick's generation, to CK's generation, quite frankly? How do we sustain that moving forward? And that's the reason why I want to show this picture, because uh, there's, yes, there's still a lot of untapped potential, but it's also living proof. It's live and in living color that the sustainability aspect of achieving a regenerative future is strong. And I think the one thing that we need to remember as well, just to add to what Patrick and Daniel said when it comes to uh, well, the regenerative future. I think it's one that is fueled by passion and grounded by compassion. And I think it's ironic in the Philippine context that when we talk about regenerative future, a lot of the characteristics of a regenerative future is actually already deeply ingrained in the Philippine culture. And I point to the one word that we still struggle to translate to English. As much as we want to redefine resilience by coining the term katumbalikwasan, but there's this other term in the Philippine culture, bayanihan. So bayanihan, of course, that's the spirit of community building, that's interconnectedness, right? That a lot of the characteristics of regenerative future is already in our culture. So why isn't it translating into well what a regenerative future should be? And I think that's what we as climate advocates, experts, communicators, and everything in between, we need to figure out moving forward because at the end of the day, climate action speaks louder than words.
Love everything. I mean, if we only had AI companion over here, I would have captured a lot of quotes already that I could use. Now, put them on stickers, print them out, and then stick them on my notebooks. Because I mean, gentlemen, you have provided us with a lot of insights and even a lot of wisdom. Um, Thank you very much for all that you do, but also thank you very much for lending us your time, for carving out time for this episode. I am sure that our listeners have picked up a lot from here and would relish an opportunity also to converse with you in some shape or form, and also catch you in Alter Cup 30 Philippines this November. So once again, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you as well.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, folks. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for hanging out with us. That it has been a very productive 97 minutes, in my clock. I sure have taken a lot of notes. Basically, collective action is such a powerful word, but also packs a lot of meaning. And the three gentlemen just synthesize everything for us from their own perspective and their experience. And I do hope that this also inspires you to um, be engaged in a community that's working on climate action or for empowering local communities, peoples, and essentially also help others alleviate from poverty and some other cause that really matters to you. And if you also have the privilege or even the resources to jumpstart something, then I hope you also see that as an opportunity too, to make it happen. Because believe it or not, there are a lot of people who can support you. And just by hearing the experiences of these gentlemen, these three people who have been working and have been terrific at what they do, uh, the collaboration is really really omnipresent. It's there. It's a spirit that I think is being passed on from generation to generation, and that us people, we really share these certain values that help us, work on a unified goal and find how we can contribute regardless how big or small that is. And so collective action definitely is much needed. Much urgency is also needed, and I think collective action with urgency really makes things happen, for us, for the world, and also for the Philippines, for a regenerative future that we deserve. Everybody deserves, especially also those that are neglected in the society. Well, that's everything for today's session, this episode. Thank you very much for joining the show. By the way, my name is CK once again, and please do not forget to engage with us at Alter Cop 30 Philippines. This is a mini series, and we're gonna air a few more episodes before we take on the main stage at the last week of November. So that's November 26th to 28th. So that's 3 days for the main stage, and we also have a November 8th um, event for MSMEs. And If you wanted to engage with the Alter Cup 30 Philippines team, you can catch us on social media. We have a LinkedIn page if you really like to keep it professional, but we also have Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube if you want to catch more of what we do and engage in future content. Basically, this goes out to the social media channels. So please stay tuned for that. And well, you're already watching this anyway. So stay tuned for future episodes. But I guess you can also go to our website. That's www.altercop, uh, altercop.com/Philippines. And from there, or there, you can catch our resources, panel of speakers, guests, and other relevant information that you can find for whatever is going to happen in AlterCop 30 Philippines main stages. So, well, folks, thank you very much again for joining us today. And I hope from this day on, you get to find your peers, find your network, and be able to work on something bigger than yourself. Thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.